Good afternoon. I'd first like to thank the USC School of Social Work, the Law School, Professor Lyon and Professor McCroskey.
Cell phones. Turn your cell phones to the OFF position.
Anyways, as I was saying, I'd like to very much thank the USC School of Social Work, the Law School, Professor Lyon, and Professor McCroskey, Hillary Chisholm, and the many others who took the time to organize this event and who invited me to talk today about some of our nation's most vulnerable children, about my own childhood in foster care, and about my work as a lawyer representing children and families in child welfare systems. Over 500,000 American children live in foster care. The average American foster child is 10 years old, slightly more likely to be a boy than a girl. Overwhelmingly, their parents are poor, as are their grandparents. Most children enter foster care not because of abuse, but because they are poor. Few ever see a social worker on a regular basis, and all are 5 times more likely to be abused in state care than the children they leave behind in the community. For foster children under 5 years of age, only an estimated 18% are enrolled in preschool education, and when asked why children in their care have gone unenrolled, nearly 80% of foster care providers answer that no one advised them to do so. Among young children older than 5, 67% will attend 3 or more elementary schools. Older foster children are less likely to be enrolled in college preparatory classes, even when they have similar test scores and grades. They are generally socially isolated in school and are rarely involved in extracurricular activities. Among the 20,000 who leave state care as young adults, only half graduate from high school. Once they do, of the few who attend or enroll in post-secondary education, only 2% graduate from college, compared to a graduation rate of 64% for their non-foster care peers. Ironically, when asked, though, 70% of all former foster youth say they would have liked to have gone to college. In the end, their overall educational outcomes lag behind even those of children living in our country's most economically distressed neighborhoods. Plainly speaking, foster children do worse than the poorest of their non-foster peers. Before they reach 20, 60% will not have a job, a third of the boys will be in prison, 84% of those left behind will have become parents themselves. So I hope you believe me when I say that I'm truly grateful to be here today. I was taken from my mother as she was from hers. She grew up in the shadow of Pikes Peak outside Colorado Springs. She never went to college or graduated from high school. She was a beautiful woman who met a man when she was 16, married him when she was 17, and had me before her 18th birthday. They went to prison together for writing bad checks. When I was 5 years old, she was released. She summoned me from her mother, and then was quickly abandoned by the man whom she had married. For the next 2 years, she was mom. She did what she could to educate herself, enrolled in beauty school, and then with me at her side, descended into delusions of schizophrenia. She lost her job first and the little chance that had come with it. And in the string of tiny apartments, landlords cut the electricity and the water. And in the darkness around us, she became convinced that the voices she heard, argued with, and tried so desperately to please were the voices of men determined to take me from her and to harm us both. Sadly, in some strange way, she was right. On a warm February day in North Hollywood, California, a policeman rolled up alongside me and asked me if my name was Andy. As my mother screamed in the street, a woman from the county hustled me into a waiting car and deposited me at McLaren Hall, Los Angeles County shelter care facility for foster children, but more accurately, its equivalent of a public orphanage. County supervisors had come up with the idea themselves of a separate facility on the outskirts of Los Angeles for foster children, one that would no longer house them at juvenile hall. However, supervisors saw no need to change the facility's daily administration and left it to the County Department of Probation. The Probation Department promptly surrounded the facility with perimeter fencing, lacing it with barbed wire. It recruited employees from the existing juvenile hall to administer the facility and care for its children. Then, to maintain order, chose armed guards to patrol its hallways. In a collection of warehouse-style dormitories divided by sex and roughly by age, hundreds of children from day-old newborns to 18-year-old adolescents slept in vast grids of beds and attended an on-site school with a curriculum deemed appropriate for children regarded as uniformly slow. McLaren was little more than a violent dumping ground where new children like myself were housed, but before being moved on to foster families. But more tragically, there were other children at the facility, ones whom the county described as having failed their placements, who were sent back, institutionalized there for the remainder of their childhood, or who were cycled through an endless chain of temporary foster homes, group homes, psychiatric wards, and juvenile detention centers. McLaren was not some Dickensian institution. McLaren was redesigned, enlarged multiple times, and not closed until 2003, more than 20 years after I left Los Angeles County Care. After several months at McLaren, two staff supervisors woke me in the early morning, gave me the clothes that I had arrived in, and told me to get dressed. In the time that I had been there, I had seen my mother only once in a courtroom at my detention hearing, a proceeding where we were not allowed to speak with, hug, or touch each other. I had not seen a social worker or any mental health worker until another unknown woman packed me into her car at McLaren and drove me to the opposite end of Los Angeles, a place that I had never heard of and to which I had no connections. The social worker informed me that it was a temporary foster home, promised to come back for me in a few weeks, but never did. I stayed in that house for the next 11 years. As an adult, I'm reminded of the importance of every interaction with a child, whether by a social worker, a lawyer, a guardian ad litem, a mentor, or a judge, and how often that importance still goes forgotten. As a boy, those earliest interactions with my first and second social workers, and overwhelmingly with those who followed, taught me critical lessons. One, that their role was to remove children from what they knew and take them to what they did not. And two, once that task was completed, they were never to be seen again. My foster mother, the woman who was now to assume the role of my actual mother, knew her own terrors. A woman from Europe who survived a children's camp outside Dachau, she knew what it meant to be hungry and frightened like the children she later took in. In my foster parents' words and my social worker's silence, I was regularly reminded of being the child whose mother had failed him and the condemnation they carried for her. In a system that has historically taken far too many children into care and kept them longer than they needed to be, I hope that you will allow me one bit of advice, almost a plea of sorts to those of you who work with foster children, who govern their lives, and who care for them. Regardless of what we may know, what we may have read in a case file, what we may think of a child's parent in our hearts, if a child loves a parent, and overwhelmingly they do, allow them that love. Allow them that faith that they are worthwhile, that they meant something to the person who, despite what we may think, is and always will be in some way their beginning and their end. Hard as it may be, try to remember that a parent might fail but still love a child, that failure and love are not exclusive but can exist side by side, that a mother can love a child more than she can care for him. Indeed, of the dozens of social workers that I had, I remember the name of only one who did just that. She was the one who came into that bedroom in my foster parents' house, shut the door, and silently with an 8-year-old boy who refused to talk about anything other than a goldfish swimming in a bowl across the room. She was new to the department, and it was her first job. I was her first case. But sitting beside me in those quiet hours, she proved to a little boy that she would wait with him, that she would do what she said she did, and when the time arrived, she would come back when she was supposed to. In the 2 years that I was on her caseload, she did her job and kept her promises to me. She was the one who softly reminded that little boy that his mother did and always would love him, regardless of what she may have known. When my foster mother threatened to throw me out in my second semester of 12th grade, threatened college and all that I had worked for, 9 years had passed since I had been on that social worker's caseload and last seen her. But she was the one I called from a high school telephone, begging for her to help me, to do something so that not all would be lost. And she was the one who again did her job, intervened, and saved what I had worked for, saved my future. We can do so much better. Despite the talk of family values, the vast majority of child welfare funding continues to go toward tearing impoverished families apart rather than keeping them together, to identifying their failures rather than their possibilities. Even with funding waivers, wraparound services, and family preservation assistance, at its core, our nation's child welfare system continues to offer foster care departments the greatest financial rewards for the number of children they remove from their families and for the length of time they keep those children in care. The greatest failure of foster care still lingers, the failure to assess, recognize, and support the strengths of children in its care. To understand that in removing a child from his or her family, we promise not just the duty of a caretaker, as we refer to those who feed and clothe and bed a foster child today. We take on much more than that. We promise the duty of parents, like those who are undoubtedly in this room this afternoon, ones who see beyond the frustrations, the difficulties, perhaps even the disabilities of their own children, and who refuse to surrender their obligation to recognize and encourage the unique goodness and talents that exist in every child and human being. Even with McLaren gone, the problem that it symbolizes persists in child welfare, the ratcheting up of children with needs through ever more restricted, isolated, and punitive settings. We continue to operate a system that pathologizes children, increasing the dollar value that a provider receives by the number of deficits he or she can identify a child with. We do little to reward positive treatment that meets the challenges of those deficits. In fact, the successful treatment of a child's deficit only reduces the dollar value that a child offers a given placement and a child welfare bureaucracy. Finally, we do little to nothing for the provider who recognizes a child's strength and works for and achieves positive outcomes for that child. Quite simply, the provider who can label a child violent and assaultive and who does nothing to help receives the greatest financial rewards, while the provider who labels a child intelligent, good at sports, or possessing other talents, and then supports that child in school, gets him or her on an athletic team, and encourages his or her talents, receives nothing. Most would say that my mother failed. She did in many ways. But in the brief time that she was mine and I hers, she showed me that some promises could be made and kept. And so, as I waited for her, I looked for more promises, and some of those were kept. In a 5th grade elementary school teacher who showed a bit of kindness and insisted that the boy who hung at her side was better than just slow. In a 12th grade English teacher who never knew that the shy 16-year-old seated at the edge of her class went home to a foster family every night, but who took the time to teach him the difference between a good poem and a bad one, and how to write a proper sentence. In child welfare, we talk a great deal about children's risks and strengths. To go through those of a boy who watched his mother's rape, who saw her lying in a bathtub, her arms cut to shreds with a razor and his name smeared in blood on the walls, to quiet voices that could never be quieted, who lost her when he was 7 years old and spent the rest of his childhood in foster care. My case file would have listed plenty of them. In family stresses, my mother and I lived on public assistance and in poverty. My parents were separated, and there were frequent family moves as we were evicted from place to place, finally arriving in the flop house of a motel where we dug for food from dumpsters. In parental disorders, my mother had a profound mental illness and some history of criminality. In experiential history, I was witness to extreme conflict and violence, endured neglect at the hands of my mother, and physical abuse at the hands of her boyfriends. Yet there were strengths, too. In early development, I had a positive attachment to my mother and to my grandmother. If I didn't have an easy temperament, as some in this room already know, I was certainly independently minded. In my family history, I lived with my grandmother in the time that my mother was in prison. My grandmother was consistently employed. We went to church. She certainly gave me chores and made certain that I knew what behavior was acceptable and what was not. My relationships with my mother was positive regardless of what others thought. There was warmth between us, and my mother, in her own way, participated in school activities. In child competencies, I was good at school. I understood that and was involved in extracurricular activities. In social skills, I got along with others, had a sense of humor, and my mother, grandmother, and God gave me empathy. Finally, on my outlook and attitude as a child and teenager, I can best describe it by what was there at the end of my first 17 years of life, in a college essay that I never wrote or sent, but what I put down in a book years later to explain it as best I could. Dear Admissions Officer, my name is Andy Bridge. I am a senior at Monte Vista High School, and I have lived in foster care since I was 7 years old. I don't think that you get many applications from foster children. I'm not sure why I feel that way. No one told me not to do this, and no one said that I should. It's the quiet space in the middle where people say the most. The quiet is what tells you not to expect much, and that not much is expected of you. Before you have finished, and maybe already, I suppose that you will want to know what made this particular foster child apply. I suppose you will also want to know what made me different from the others who have never written you. From the grades and organizations that I have listed, you may want to believe that I am a popular boy. The kind of boy who takes easily to others, and who even in a crowd of friends still stands apart. But I am not that kind of boy. I have stood apart, but have done it mostly alone. I am a boy who needed to keep everything separate, who needed to keep school separate from home, and who he was separate from who was around him. I hope that you will not think less of me, because I have found my way to honors and titles that did not require friends. I also think that you may want to learn about someone who has always been there for me, someone who helped me along the way and in the end got me to you. I have to tell you that I would have liked that too. But if I could show you McLaren Hall or the house where I have grown up, you would see that angels and saviors are rare. Then, like me, you would know to stop looking for them too. What I can tell you is that I learned my lessons quickly. I learned the importance of my county bed, and I have always known not to lose it. I learned never to be just another boy who came and went. I learned to please my teachers and to make them like me. I studied hard and managed tests especially well. If I'm not close to my classmates, I learn from them what it means to believe that good things lie ahead. My mother warned me that she would not be around forever, that I would have to fend for myself. I wish she had warned me that I would miss her and feel this alone. It's like when you're little in a crowded store and with your mom, and holding your hand, she bends down to you and says, "If I lose you, just stay where you are. Don't wander off." Sometimes when you're lost, the most you can do is wait. More than anything else, that is what I have learned to do best, to wait, to outlast the fear, and to hold on just a bit longer. Finally, when you read this, I hope that you will not feel sorry for me, because even in years of quiet, the Lord can still find his way. I wish I could honestly say that the system that raised me and the social workers who carried me on their caseloads recognized and supported those strengths. In truth, they rarely did. Even today, it is hard to say that we do anything but fail miserably when it comes to educating children in our care and preparing them for full and meaningful lives. Still, I hope very much that you will not regard that as an insult or as hostile to those who work in foster care, who do what they can for children. We have made great strides in the time since I was a ward of Los Angeles. Today, a 7-year-old boy who entered foster care would not be allowed to linger for 11 years in a home that refused to adopt him or to assume guardianship. His mother would not be limited to visiting him once a month for an hour and to 15-minute phone calls once a week. His foster parents would be trained and expected not to regard her with hostility or as a threat. His grandmother would be encouraged, indeed offered the financial and social support to take him from care. We have come closer to recognizing that foster care can save children and mend families rather than only tear them apart. That foster children deserve the future that all children deserve. We recognize what each of us in our own hearts already knows, that a childhood lasts forever. And if we have yet to achieve the outcomes for children that we would like, we now at least acknowledge their importance. Every childhood can be that treasure house of memories that we hope for our own children. Every child can believe that good things lie ahead. A poet once bitterly described the future as nothing more than a clutter of promises that we have in our power to take away the bitterness and at long last to do what we say we will, to keep the promises we make. Thank you for inviting me this afternoon. I'm happy to take questions. The first one's always the toughest. Yeah.
I have a question. What happened to your mother?
My mother, I don't know how many folks know the progress of paranoid schizophrenia. My mother's still alive. She lives in a large group home outside of Phoenix with other folks with paranoid schizophrenia and other types of schizophrenia. It is a very cruel disease, one that is degenerative over time, and so she is quite withdrawn. Our visits are very quiet. The last time that I was with her was actually over Christmas, and we did something quite nice. We cut her hair, which was something that I remember her doing, and something that she loved to do as a 22-year-old or 23-year-old woman. So she's okay.
What do you feel motivated you to go to college and not to law school? You said that there wasn't anyone in particular who really pushed you to do that or told you to do that. So, what changed? What was the difference for you?
Well, I think that in my case, first of all, let me say you're right. If we just looked at the Department of Children's Services, it was called PEN. They did, and this is not to be harsh, but to be as truthful as I can, they really did nothing. They really had no idea what my goings-on were in school. And I think for folks who are involved in foster care today, that wouldn't surprise you because the situation really hasn't improved all that much. It hasn't, in some extent, but not all that much. What was lucky with me was that I simply had a set of skills that fit very neatly with another bureaucracy, and that was the Los Angeles Unified School District. And what that meant was that even as a little boy, I liked the feel of praise from a teacher. I liked the feel of doing well on a test. That meant something to me, that landed in me and it stuck. And I think that really what the question then leads you to is what at least I regard is one of the most serious failings of foster care, and I talked about it a few moments ago, and that is that foster care departments don't make there's very little effort that's ever spent in finding those strengths. When they do exist there and they happen to land somewhere, it's largely a coincidence. You don't, the example that I use is a parent never stops. You know, a parent may have a 10-year-old Johnny, and Johnny may not be very good at school, but Johnny is really funny. And you will see that parent do everything they can to support them. Or Michaela. Michaela may not be good at school, but she's a great basketball player. And that parent is doing everything, they're showing up at every game, and that kid is on the basketball team. And then they don't stop for Michaela, they're on to the next. That doesn't happen in foster care. There are not a set of incentives, there's not a set of training, there's not a set of follow-up that produces those sorts of outcomes. If that answers your question. I got lucky.
Do you still have a relationship with your foster family, or?
No, I don't. My foster family was not an ideal family in any ways. It was my foster mother was a deeply troubled woman, as I alluded to. She spent 4 years from age 8 to 12 in a Nazi concentration, in a slave camp. And that produced a very strong and terrifying episodic rage, which was also, to be quite honest, quite a large woman, and I was quite a small boy. To give you an example, I ran into, a few months ago, hunted down one of my old social workers, and to give you an idea how small a boy I was, she looked at me and she said, "Oh, you're big." I think we all were laughing. But in any event, she was quite a terrifying woman, and in the end, a very sad and isolated woman. The relationship finally ended. It continued through college and through law school, mostly simply because they were there. I mean, it's very hard to have no there. And then finally it ended shortly after law school. I was diagnosed with lymphoma, and I called to tell them this, and they couldn't come to the phone because they were eating. So it ended, and I haven't talked to them for quite some time. That's okay. That's okay. Yes?
What suggestions do you have? I'm a foster mom. My foster daughter, I'm one of those people who puts the taxi light on the car and I'm riding her all over the place. But she hits those patches of depression, trying to figure out why her mom wouldn't do what the court asked her to do so they could get back together. And I tell her, I know she misses her, and she should miss her because she loves her so much, and that her mom loves her. But sometimes even that, it's hard to do the things that people require of you. So I'm trying to have a balanced thing and trying to encourage her to keep loving her mom, and that her mom does love her, but she still hits those rough patches. And when she hits those rough patches, and we have all kind of bad reports coming from school because she's acting out, and all that kind of stuff. What should I do? Should I continue to encourage her to love her mom, continue to reassure her of her mom's love and all that kind of stuff? Because in her mind, it's not matching up. No matter what I say, it's like right. I don't want to hear it. So what do I do?
I don't know your foster daughter.
She's brilliant, but she doesn't believe it.
I don't know, and I'm sure that there are many people in this room who can.
I'm feeling for her. I'm a social worker. Are you, is she getting therapy?
Yes.
And that doesn't help her?
She loves meeting with her therapist because she's one of the most caring people I've ever met. And it's like going to see a good friend, you know. And, we're working together, so we're getting a huddle because I believe the team approach with people that are helping my kid. We work together as a team, and it helps some. But when you have that deep, deep, deep desire to be with your mom and she's not there, she's not doing what's required to make that possible.
I can't say what I would tell you to do with your daughter, but I can say with a little more confidence what I admire in you just watching you right now, and that is I admire that willingness and that comfort within yourself and that relationship with your foster daughter who is your baby, and your willingness to include her mother in that relationship and not be intimidated or frightened by that. And that's wonderful. I admire you're going through those patches. And I think my guess is what that shows is an understanding that in some way your daughter has a right to those patches. And that's a wonderful thing, because sadly we rarely give children that right to mourn their loss.
That's it.
Yes, sir.
If you had a group of students who were being educated on becoming social welfare advocates, on what changes in policies or modifications of public policies would you direct them?
Which time would we do it?
You rested the fact that there have been some improvements.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things that can be done. I think that I think there are soft and hard changes that we can do. On the soft side of things, I think that we do a very poor job at going toward identifying children's strengths and identifying their risks, and then backing that up with the hard side of it, which is paying providers for which we want. You know, what do we want them to do? Do we want them to identify risks? And if so, how do we want them to identify risks? And what are we going to pay them for when we identify risks? And what are we going to pay them when they do or do not respond to those risks? At the same time, I'm very much in favor of going ahead and paying providers and providing incentives, other incentives to them for identifying strengths, following up on those strengths, and achieving things that are related to those strengths. So it may sound a little weird, but I have no problem with paying providers money when their kids come home with straight A's. In the same way, to put in something that's probably a little more traditional, I have no money when in Los Angeles County for folks, I don't know how many, it's hard for me, I don't know how many people know sort of the way foster care works in LA County. There are two types of foster homes. One is a group of homes that are run directly by the department, very roughly speaking. The other group is a group of private foster family, they're called foster family agencies, right? When a foster family agency has a family that adopts a child, right? And that foster family agency no longer takes in foster children. That foster family agency has lost a tremendous investment, right? They've lost a great deal of training, they've lost placement, and we can go on and on. They've lost an asset. And, for example, we ought to pay for that. We ought to compensate for that, because what does that do? That provides the proper incentives that we want. And the truth is, what we want is we want FFA parents to adopt their children, rather than doing what we do, which are largely a set of policies that encourage, we don't like to call it this anymore, but permanent foster care. So those are, and we can go on, I can go on. But also in favor of evaluating group homes and publishing.
Thank you very much for sharing your story. I think it's very powerful. I think it's very powerful to share one's story. And I was wondering if you could reflect a bit. I missed the beginning, so I think you may have covered this already, but could you reflect a little bit about what you get personally out of sharing your story with us, and why now at this time in your life?
Well, for example, Jacqueline, Professor McCloskey, When I was head of the Alliance for Children's Rights, and before that, it was certainly no secret that I grew up in foster care. I talked about it, at speeches. I got a big annual dinner and talked about it every time. The one thing that I rarely ever talked about, that I actually never talked about, was my mom. Every now and then, I might sort of be what I thought was clever. I'd give a dinner speech or something, and I'd slip in a line like, tonight is an evening about hope, knowing that there were 3 people in the back of the room who I'd comped that would know what I meant by that. And so now I think this book really, what it meant to me was my mother's getting older. Her disease is becoming more aggressive in a different way. And I wanted to write that before she died. She can't read this book. She doesn't have the capacity to do it, but to be honest, I wanted it so that she'd still recognize it. And beyond that very selfish thing, I know the people in this room know, but the people in that bigger room may not, and that is that this actually happens to people. That a woman can lose everything. That she can lose, in my case, in her case, excuse me, that she can lose her only child, that she can lose her freedom, and that she can lose what I think any person would consider a full and meaningful life. The extent of which I would say was, and the brutality with which it took place in her life was not necessary. That's not to say that I think she could have raised me alone, but she didn't need to go through what she went through. That's about my mom. Yes?
You're a wonderful example of resiliency, and I haven't heard that you use that term, but you certainly describe that term. And I'm wondering what your recommendations are for the system in terms of better creating resiliency when it's not there, or strengthening resiliency when it is there. And if the system isn't doing this, how could the system better create and strengthen resiliency in foster children?
Yeah, I guess I'm being a lawyer. We have a little bit of a different language, and when I use strength, I actually mean resiliency. And so, what I would say is, oh, thank you so much, is to do some of the things that I've talked about already, and there are soft and there are hard parts of it, since you give me the opportunity, I'll give another hard part of that, and that is really taking a look at the performance levels that we get out of care providers, a word that I'm not a fan of. I can't imagine any one of us ever would want to be in a care provider's home, but looking at care providers individually, seeing the outcomes that they're producing for these children, evaluating them, and deciding who do we want and who do we not, and letting go of those we don't. So, yes. That line I couldn't scare everybody up.
So on that note, Andrew, would you tell us a little bit about your next book? Because I think it does relate to what you were just talking about.
Thank you. When I first graduated from law school, took a little bit. Shortly after I graduated from law school, I took a job with a group called the Basel Center in Washington, D.C., which is a fairly large and sort of serious legal services outfit that does impact litigation. And I worked on a very old mental health case that was, by the time I got there, it was 24 years old. It was called Wyatt. Well, the original title was Wyatt v. Stickney. And it involved basically every individual who was in the Alabama state mental health system. So that meant everything from elders in state nursing homes, who I would go and visit and see bed sores the size of footballs, to adults in state psychiatric facilities, for example, Rice Hospital in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which was built in 1853, and see someone, who was on the back ward For those of you, the back wards are typically in this old way, the punishment wards. Where you put the people you really don't want, where you really don't want to be as a patient, I'll tell you that, and where you're not leaving, and you can be kept there for years. Who've been in this institution for 20, 30 years, all the way down to kids, and I was given the kids. And for the most part, I was given the kids because kids had never played a big part in the case. And what I did is I represented a group of children at a place called the Eufaula Adolescent Center, which was a mental health facility for boys and girls that had about 120 kids. It was in Eufaula, Alabama, which is a very small rural town in southeast Alabama. It was a fairly savage place. It was a place where two boys had hanged themselves, one of whom had actually killed himself, and the other had suffered severe hypoxic brain damage as a result. I don't have a lot of tolerance for mental health facilities that keep closed bars in closets, or who keep glass. Anyway, it was a facility that clearly had no idea, and when it was informed of a better idea of how to run itself, really didn't care. There were episodes of staff raping children in bathroom stalls, and this is not an exaggeration, it's hard to believe, but of keeping children in cells, outside cells. This was also in 1995. So, in any event, the facility was closed by a federal district judge, which is an unusual thing in today's, looking at the lawyers. In today's environment, federal judges do not like to close facilities because it steps on the toes of governors and of state officials. The facility was closed, and the second book really is about my relationship with the boys and a few of the girls, and what happened to them, how they feel about a lawyer who came and left, who in some ways used them, how they felt about, in some cases, being the star of a trial, the federal courthouse in Montgomery, and then being marched down the stairs and shown their way to a cab. And then, of course, where they are today. So, to give examples of a couple of them, I can say their names because I have releases. Jeremiah Ray Bond. Jeremiah Ray Bond is a 24-year-old man. He was ritualistically sexually abused by his father when he was 5 years old. He was taken into foster care when he was 7 years old. He was adopted by his aunt and uncle. He was then sexually abused again by his aunt and uncle. He was then retaken into the state mental health system and gone in and out of several state psychiatric hospitals, and by the time I met him, he was at Eufaula. He was 13 years old. At that point, Jeremiah had declared himself a cannibal. What he really, if he were being truly accurate, it would have been self-cannibalization. What he did is he bit into himself, and to this day I can't quite figure out how he did it, because he would bite into his shoulders, and my neck just doesn't work that way, but would pull out chunks of flesh, and indeed today you will still see, if he pulls his shirt down, you'll still see these half-moon bites that start from here and go all the way down there. Excuse me. He hid in trees because he was afraid of other kids. Kids knew his background. He was in some ways highly sexualized because of his background. When Eufaula was closed, he went through 10 different psychiatric facilities, eventually ending up in Bryce, the hospital that I mentioned. Left Bryce when he was 21 years old, went back to Tuscumbia, which, for those of you who don't know, is, anyone know what Tuscumbia is famous for? The hometown of Helen Keller. But he went back up there, felt himself decompensating, and tried to go back into the mental health system. He succeeded for about a month, and the doctor told him that he was looking for a free bed and drugs, gave him a handful of brain scans, and told him to go to a neurologist. In Jeremiah's words, he said, I knew my head was already fucked, and so I threw the scans in the back seat and never did it. Shortly thereafter, Jeremiah became addicted to crack, and in that addiction showed up to the only person whoever showed any love to him on a consistent basis showed up to his grandmother's house, wanting money. She didn't have any. That's how he strangled her. He now resides in the Bessemer, the William E. Donaldson State Penitentiary in Bessemer, Alabama. It is the end of the line in terms of state penitentiaries in Alabama, and has been sentenced to life without possibility of parole. And in perhaps the cruelest of ironies for Jeremiah, well, I suppose there are two. There are many. The first being that, of course, he is now back in state care. The second thing is, as he told me, Andy, there are two things that you don't want to be in prison. What do you want? What do you mean? So the first is that you don't want to be white. And that I kind of got. He said, because the judge was white, the lawyers are white, the prosecutor's white, you don't want to be white. He said that the second thing you don't want to be is you don't want to be poor. Alabama has no inmate, well, it does actually have small inmate work programs, but for inmates who are sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, they're excluded from them because there's no point. So, in the second brutal irony, Jeremiah returns to his 5-year-old experience. Jeremiah is a prison prosecutor. I spend time in other kids. The most successful are kids, I find kids who have kind of, working jobs, living in the backs of garages. Some of the qualities that you see in common are intense, unresolved anger, unintegrated lives that most of us would consider extremely lonely. One boy who lives in Pensacola, Florida, I drove down, and he actually lives in a little shed in the back of a house. And I asked him, finally asked him for about 2 hours, I said, well, how'd you feel when you were 13 and you fall? And he just shrugged and said, ain't nobody in my corner. And so the second book is about that. There are a few success stories, but frankly, excuse me for saying this, but not the sort of success that, not what we would consider success on a campus like USC.
So you were given this case as the first out of law school, and what was the outcome?
The outcome was, for the first time, I'm very proud of that, for the first time.
You need to read the book.
No, for the first time, in a 33-year-old case, an opinion was devoted solely to children in the case. And a monitor was imposed on the facility, and the facility was closed.
First of all, I'm very honored to be here today. It's just a wonderful experience to hear you and seeing the involvement that you have now with creating or reinforcing change makes me wonder how it is that you cope with your own experience. Like, for example, you were talked about being at McLaren Hall, and now visiting or talking with children who are in similar situations where you've been. How is it that you cope with, or how does it affect you now, and how is it that you cope with whatever that may bring up?
We get better at it. No, thank you. I won't deny that there were times that I was very clumsy at it, and I won't deny that there were times. One of the most shocking moments was when after about 4 years of working at the Alliance, I'd sort of walked around town assuming that I was completely anonymous and that there was no way that anyone at the department could have ever remembered my case. It's a huge department. It was an old case. And I found out that one of the deputy directors of the department not only knew my case, but knew my mother. And that was a difficult thing. It was a difficult thing to sit across a conference room. It added a new dimension to arguments. And that was a hard thing. The first time I went to McLaren, I recall looking at my feet and whispering, but you get better. And I'm very thankful to be able to do it, because what fills that is, the other day I got to speak with a bunch of kids at ACS, which is the Administration for Children's Services, which is New York's DCFS. And as you get better at that, the nice part of that is that there's more room inside of you for those kids. And it's quite wonderful to have a 13 or 14-year-old boy or girl, having no idea that you grew up in foster care, trust you. So.
I have a quick question. As far as your Alliance for Children's Rights, do I have that right?
Everything but the your part.
Do you have that in different chapters, or? Or
No, I was executive director of the Alliance for Children's Rights. The Alliance for Children's Rights is a wonderful legal services organization that provides. Can I still do the spiel? The Alliance for Children's Rights is Los Angeles County's only not-for-profit legal services organization serving children in poverty. There's a joke in there about the way every nonprofit needs to carve out its own special to make it unique from every other nonprofit. But the Alliance today does wonderful work with adoptions, and it has a wonderful mentoring program. But my understanding is the Alliance at Jacqueline, the Alliance doesn't have an office somewhere else. No. Yeah, it's just
here now?
it's just now. Yeah. 3333.
Thank you.
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for sharing your story and for touching our hearts. And second, I was wondering, as a child, what gave you hope and what were your hopes?
Well, I think that really, the biggest thing, and for folks who, I didn't catch your name, but Mom, sort of got there a bit, and that was, at least for me, one of the biggest things was to know that my mom loved me and that I meant something, and that never left me. Now, my foster mother was quite different. My foster mother did not support that relationship and was actually quite hostile to it. So, for example, when that hour ended, I was called out of the room, and I was told that I was then to go back into the room and tell my mother that it was time for her to go. So I was left to mediate that relationship. But it was that, and then very simple things about doing well in school, having the good fortune of finding something on my own that fit. Yeah.
I want to thank you for sharing your story. Particularly, I want to thank you for talking about that single social worker who made such a difference in your life. Because in my classes, I have lots of students who are interning at the DCFS right now. And a lot of the despair that they feel within the system comes through these discussions that we're having in class about how can they change something in the department, how can they ever change anything about the child's life or make any type of an impact. And I think that your story came across very strong on that point. And I'm glad some of them are here to hear it. And I'm glad I'll be able to go back and talk more about it in classes. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you still keep in touch with your social worker? Or do you touch base with her once in a while?
I actually reconnected with her around November. And we write, and it's good to see her. She's retired now, but we don't have that kind of relationship.
Right,
and I think we
right.
both, yeah. Are we fond of each other? Yeah. Was she very happy to see Andy? Yeah. Was I happy to see her? Yeah.
There's an outside chance that there are a few people who work for the department here. It is so critically important that the children are assessed again, to discover what their strengths are. My daughter is so far behind, and I got her into some tutorial things, and I'm just like cheering her on, and letting her know how important this is. And when the people that work with her, they have power over her, don't look at that. They couldn't understand how she got so far behind. I said, well, who took time to check her out?
No, I agree with you. I don't focus on the percentages, for example, on tutoring.
Yeah.
It's, I'll say that, according to the Vera Institute, for example, in New York City, it's about 84% of children in foster care who receive 1 month of tutoring advanced by 2 months. It can do it.
And just to say this and to drop it, DCFS, they don't provide support for that. And so I take the money they give me and I send her to tutoring because she needs it. And just let the chips fall where they may, because we're talking about her future chances. That's how I see it. And it's an investment in that, and I think she's well worth it. My kid, she works here. My daughter, she got her master's from here. She used to come to work. I used to work here for the Joint Educational Project. And when I left here, I continued my relationship with people here. And so they're just an adjunct to our family. So she called me this morning. She said, Mom, you got to come see this. You're on.
I've had that reaction before,
Thank you
but for
so
different
much.
reasons.
Maybe there's lots more to ask, but I hope some people might want a little one-on-one and maybe get you to sign your book. And so perhaps we could sort of break at this point. On behalf of School of Social Work and the School of Law, we're just so grateful.
Thank you so much.